This video is going to be a quick introduction to Modo's production renderer. And the production renderer is a little more complicated to use than the preview renderer. And when using the production renderer, the first decision you have to make is which engine to use. So in the shading tab, I'm going to select the render item. And the first thing you see in the properties form is this drop-down labeled renderer. And the first option is labeled default, and that's Modo's original render engine, which is optimized for speed. But if you click on the drop-down, you can see there's a second option labeled MPath. And this is a newer render engine, which uses a different ray tracing algorithm called path tracing, which is much more accurate. And MPath is also quite a lot easier to use because there's far fewer settings that you need to worry about when rendering your scene. But let's return to the default render engine, and I'm going to switch to the Global Illumination tab so we can take a look at the options that we have here. If I scroll down to the bottom of the Global Illumination panel, you can see that there is a section labeled Irradiance Caching, which is enabled by default. Irradiance caching is a global illumination algorithm which is very, very fast, but somewhat inaccurate. However, there are certain scenes in which it can work exceptionally well. And the kind of scene where irradiance caching works particularly well are scenes where you have large light sources and a prominent environment. And the scene that we're working on just so happens to be exactly the right kind of scene for irradiance caching. There are no small light sources or small windows for the environment to be visible through. Instead, we have large area lights and the environment is visible all around the scene. And this suggests to me that the default render engine is the one to go with. But let's put it to the test. Let's go back to the frame just to make sure that the default renderer is indeed selected. And with all the settings at default, I'm simply going to hit this render button to launch Production Render Engine, and we'll let the scene render and take a look at it. And with the render complete, if I zoom in to 100% and take a look around the frame, I can see there's quite a lot of noise, but that doesn't particularly surprise me because currently all the render settings are at their default settings, which are optimized for speed rather than quality. But the good news is that the render time was just 51.2 seconds. I'm going to dismiss the render window, and making sure that the render item is still selected, I'm going to change the renderer from the default one to MPath, and I'm going to launch a new render. Now, one thing you should note about MPath is that it's a progressive renderer, and that means that it keeps rendering pass after pass until it reaches a specified noise threshold. And with the render complete, if we take a look at the elapsed time, we can see that this render took more than twice as long as the previous one to complete. And if I zoom in and take a look at the noise, I can see it's also considerably noisier. If I flick between the two, that's the previous one and that's the current one, you can see at a glance that the new render is much noisier. What's more, there's clearly a very obvious difference in materials. I can see that the materials are rendering rather differently, and the reason for this is because the subsurface scattering doesn't seem to respect the same surface only property, and so we can see all the surfaces that are placed just behind our translucent materials, which are causing these visible artifacts in the render. Now, the reason for this difference in the materials and for the increased noise is because MPath is always physically accurate, and that means it won't allow you to take any shortcuts when it comes to your shading or your rendering. And the benefit of this, of course, is that in the right circumstances, it can give you much more accurate and realistic results, but at the cost of increased render times. So it's clear to me that for this scene, we should definitely be using the default render engine. So I'm going to set the render engine back to default. And with that choice made, the next task will be to get rid of the noise that was visible in the render, and that's something we'll be doing in the next video.